On April 5, 1892, 52 armed men boarded a private train in Cheyenne, Wyoming. They carried enough ammunition to kill every person in the state, or so witnesses later claimed. In Frank Canton's leather grip sat a list of 70 names, 70 men to be shot or hanged. The train departed in secrecy, pulling out of Cheyenne in the pre-dawn darkness. No passenger lists, no public schedules, just a locomotive, 3 cars, and enough firepower to start a war. This wasn't vigilante justice. This was murder for hire. A private army funded by the wealthiest cattle barons in Wyoming with the tacit approval of the governor, both U.S. senators, and eventually the President of the United States. Their target? Johnson County. Their crime: homesteading on public land that the cattle barons considered theirs. What followed became known as the Johnson County War. It was the most notorious event in Wyoming's history, a bloodbath that exposed the corruption at the heart of frontier capitalism and changed the state's politics for a generation. This is the story of an invasion, a heroic last stand, and a 3-day siege that nearly ended in mass slaughter before the U.S. cavalry rode in to save not the victims, but the murderers. In 1884, 20 massive cattle operations controlled the entire Wyoming range. They weren't local cowboys who'd worked their way up. They were Eastern millionaires and European aristocrats who'd invested in the Great American Cattle Boom. The Wyoming Stock Growers Association, the WSGA, ran the territory like a private fiefdom. 4 of its members sat in the U.S. Congress, several were governors. The majority of state legislators belonged to the association. When the WSGA wrote rules for the cattle industry, those rules became state law. They owned the newspapers, they controlled the courts, they held sway over politicians from Cheyenne to Washington, D.C. Members gathered at the Cheyenne Club, where crystal chandeliers hung over imported carpets, and servants in white gloves poured French wine. It was the most exclusive establishment in Wyoming territory, and they grazed their cattle, sometimes numbering in the tens of thousands, on public land. Free grass, unlimited water, no fences, no boundaries, just endless prairie as far as you could see. The profits were astronomical for a while, but there was a problem. The Homestead Act allowed settlers to claim 160 acres of public land. The Desert Land Act allowed them to claim 640 acres if they irrigated it. These laws were federal, and they couldn't be changed by cattle barons or their pet legislators. When homesteaders, called nesters by the big ranchers, started claiming the best spots near water sources, the cattle barons panicked. If settlers fenced the land, where would the massive herds graze? If small ranchers built their own herds, who would work as cowboys for $30 a month? The barons blamed cattle rustling for their losses, and there was rustling, some of it. But the real problem was economic. The terrible winter of 1886 to 1887 killed hundreds of thousands of cattle. Overgrazing had depleted the range. Cattle prices collapsed. The boom had busted. Instead of adjusting their business model, the cattle barons decided to eliminate the competition permanently. In 1891, several cattle barons met in the Cheyenne Club, an exclusive gentleman's establishment where membership cost more than most cowboys made in a year. The club's rules prohibited gambling, fighting, and cheating at cards. They said nothing about murder. Frank Canton was chosen to lead the operation. Canton had been sheriff of Johnson County from 1882 to 1886. He was effective, ruthless, and terrifying. Historian Harry Sinclair Drago called him a merciless, congenital, emotionless killer. But Frank Canton wasn't his real name. He was born Josiah Horner in Texas. At age 21, he'd shot a buffalo soldier and fled north on a cattle drive, changing his identity and building a new life in Wyoming. As Canton, he'd become a stock detective for the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, tracking down suspected cattle thieves. Now the cattle barons assembled a small assassination squad. Canton would lead them. Their first target was Tom Wagoner, a German-born rancher who owned over 1,000 horses near Newcastle. There was no evidence he'd stolen them, but the big ranchers believed otherwise. On June 4, 1891, 3 men hanged Tom Wagoner. Nobody was arrested, though the identities of the killers were known. The assassination squad had proven it could kill with impunity. Their next target was Nate Champion. Champion was a 34-year-old Texan who'd worked his way north as a cowboy and built a small herd of about 200 cattle. He was one of 18 children, born near Austin. His father had been sheriff of Williamson County. His aunt had driven her own cattle to Abilene back in 1871, when women didn't do such things. Nate inherited that independence. He grazed his cattle on public land, exactly as the big cattle outfits did. He insisted his cattle had as much right to public grass as any cattle baron's herd. At the time of his death, he just paid off 8 pack horse rigs. He was planning to homestead his own ranch. Legally, Champion was absolutely right, but the cattle barons didn't care about legality. On November 1st, 1891, Canton's assassination squad attacked Champion at a cabin on the Middle Fork of Powder River. Champion and a friend, Ross Gilbertson, were asleep when 4 armed men burst in. Champion grabbed a Colt revolver from under his pillow and opened fire. He wounded 2 attackers, killing 1. The assassins fled, suffering only powder burns to Champion's face. Champion survived. But he knew too much, and so did 2 witnesses who'd overheard one attacker's confession. 3 months later, authorities found their bullet-riddled bodies. Then, in December 1891, homesteader John A. Tisdale was found dead, shot from behind in a gulch south of the Cross H Ranch. Tisdale had worked for Theodore Roosevelt as a foreman before homesteading on Red Fork. He was respected, law-abiding, and careful. Before leaving Buffalo on his last trip, Tisdale told friends he felt he was in danger. The primary suspect? Frank Canton. But when Canton boldly turned himself in and demanded a hearing, the only witness who claimed to have seen a man in Canton's coat riding Canton's horse on Canton's route couldn't positively identify him. Canton walked free. The killings continued. By early 1892, the cattle barons decided small-scale assassinations weren't enough. They needed to decapitate Johnson County's entire government. The plan was audacious, even by frontier standards. In March, agents traveled to Texas and Idaho to recruit hired gunmen. 23 men, most from Texas, signed contracts. They'd receive $5 per day plus a $50 bonus for every man killed. The invasion force eventually numbered 52 men. 11 were members of the WSGA Executive Committee, including some of Wyoming's wealthiest and most politically connected citizens. State Senator Bob Tisdale, State Water Commissioner W.J. Clark, William C. Irvine, and Hubert Teschemacher, both instrumental in Wyoming's statehood just 2 years earlier. 23 were hired guns from Texas, professional killers who'd signed contracts promising $5 per day, plus a $50 bonus for every man killed. Some were experienced gunfighters, others were just cowboys desperate for work. They were accompanied by Dr. Charles Bingham Penrose as surgeon, Ed Towse of the Cheyenne Sun, and Sam T. Clover of the Chicago Herald, whose lurid accounts would later appear in Eastern newspapers. The reporters were there to document what the cattle barons believed would be a heroic campaign against lawlessness. They would witness murder instead. Major Frank Wolcott commanded the expedition. Frank Canton carried the hit list. 70 names, 70 men to be executed without trial. Among them, Johnson County Sheriff Red Angus, the deputy sheriff, 3 county commissioners, a newspaper editor, and dozens of small ranchers and cowboys who'd committed the crime of building their own herds on public land. Acting Governor Amos Barber gave his blessing. He ordered the Wyoming National Guard not to interfere. The state constitution explicitly prohibited bringing armed bodies into Wyoming for the suppression of domestic violence, but Barber simply ignored it. The cattle barons assembled a war chest exceeding $100,000. On April 5, 1892, The private train left Cheyenne. When it reached Casper, the men unloaded their horses, their rifles, their revolvers, and enough dynamite to blow Johnson County to hell. They cut the telegraph lines as they rode north. No one could warn Buffalo. No one could call for help. Their first target was Nate Champion at the KC Ranch. Just before dawn on April 9, 1892, 52 armed men surrounded a small log cabin on the Middle Fork of Powder River. Inside were 4 men. 2 were trappers who'd stopped for the night. The third was Nick Ray, a cowboy and friend of Nate Champion, and the fourth was Champion himself. The temperature hovered near freezing. Snow fell in the darkness. The invaders had ridden through the night, arriving exhausted and cold. Many of the Texas gunmen had never experienced a Wyoming April. They shivered in the pre-dawn chill, checking their weapons, waiting for enough light to see their targets. The invaders waited for daylight. When the 2 trappers emerged to fetch water, they were captured and warned to keep their mouths shut and get out of the country. Around 7 a.m., Nick Ray stepped outside. A shot rang out. Ray staggered, fell, tried to rise, and collapsed again. Champion, inside the cabin, saw his friend go down. Under withering gunfire, Champion dragged the mortally wounded Ray back inside. Ray died a few hours later. For the next several hours, Champion fought back alone. He wounded 3 of the attackers. He might have killed 4, though accounts vary. And remarkably, during those hours, Champion kept a diary. He wrote in a small red tally book, documenting everything. The entries are brief, urgent, heartbreaking. Boys, I feel pretty lonesome just now. I wish there was someone here with me so we could watch all sides at once. There is bullets coming like hail. I don't think they intend to let me get away this time. Around 3 p.m., 2 men passed by in a wagon, Jack Flagg and his stepson, Alonzo Taylor. They saw the siege and fled, the invaders firing at them as they galloped away. The invaders captured their wagon, filled it with hay, and set it aflame. They pushed the burning wagon against the cabin. Champion knew his time was up. He signed his last diary entry, put the book in his pocket, and made his decision. He wouldn't burn alive. He wouldn't surrender to men who'd come to hang him. He checked his weapons one last time. A Colt revolver, a Winchester rifle, both nearly empty. Outside, 52 men waited with loaded guns. Champion burst out the back door with the revolver in his left hand and the rifle in his right, firing as he ran. 4 men shot simultaneously. 28 bullets hit Nate Champion. He died in the snow beside the burning cabin. One of the invaders later said, "He came out fighting and died game." The invaders pinned a card to his bullet-riddled chest, "Cattle thieves, beware." They carefully removed pages from his diary that named his attackers. Then, they mounted their horses and continued north toward Buffalo, 60 miles away. But Jack Flagg had reached Buffalo. He'd warned Sheriff Red Angus. The invasion was no longer a secret. When word reached Buffalo, the town exploded. At a raucous meeting in the Occidental Saloon, Sheriff Angus organized a posse. Local businessman Robert Foote opened his store and distributed firearms and ammunition for free. By Sunday evening, April 10th, 200 armed men rode south from Buffalo. The invaders, exhausted from riding all night and fighting at the KC Ranch, arrived at the TA Ranch on Crazy Woman Creek, 14 miles south of Buffalo. They were cold, bickering, and beginning to realize their plan had failed. The element of surprise was gone. An angry town knew they were coming. When scouts warned them that Sheriff Angus's posse was approaching, the invaders made the fateful decision to ford up. They dismounted, fortified the house and barn, dug defensive trenches, and erected breastworks. They tore apart their own wagons to reinforce the barn walls. They shot holes in the logs for rifle ports. They were preparing for a siege. The posse arrived around midnight. Many were Civil War veterans who knew how to conduct a proper siege. They surrounded the ranch, shot the invaders' horses dead so they couldn't escape, and dug firing positions in a tightening circle around the buildings. For 3 days, gunfire echoed across the prairie. The invaders suffered casualties. Gunman Jim Dudley died when his overloaded horse bucked him off during their flight to the TA Ranch. Alex Lowther shot himself in the groin while crawling for cover. The New York Times later reported that 20 invaders tried to break out behind covering fire, but the posse beat them back, killing 3 to 5 men. The posse tried everything. They requested a cannon from nearby Fort McKinney. Denied. A blacksmith named Rap Brown built a homemade cannon. It exploded on first firing. So Brown built something else. The posse called it the Go Devil, or the Ark of Safety, a massive rolling fort constructed from thick logs mounted on the running gears of 2 wagons. It was bullet-resistant, and the plan was to push it close enough to the barn to throw dynamite and force the invaders into the open. On the morning of April 13th, 14 men began moving the contraption toward the barn. The invaders were hours away from being burned out. But one of the invaders, Mike Shaughnessy, had slipped through the siege lines. He reached Douglas and sent a telegram to Governor Barber. Barber immediately contacted Wyoming's 2 U.S. senators, Joseph Carey and Francis E. Warren. Late on the night of April 12th, they went to the White House and woke President Benjamin Harrison out of bed. They told him there was an insurrection in Wyoming. They didn't clarify who was actually in insurrection against whom. Harrison, convinced that law and order had broken down, authorized a military intervention. At 12:50 a.m. on April 13th, Colonel J.J. Van Horn of the 6th Cavalry received orders to proceed to the TA Ranch. At daybreak, 107 cavalrymen arrived. Under a flag of truce, they ordered an immediate cessation of hostilities. The posse was furious. Sheriff Angus wanted to arrest the invaders and try them for murder. But the army took the invaders into custody and escorted them first to Fort McKinney near Buffalo, then to Fort D.A. Russell in Cheyenne. During their incarceration, the invaders were feted as heroes. Governor Barber visited them. They were given commemorative silver-loving cups with inscriptions like, "In grateful remembrance of untiring devotion on our behalf during the trying time of the Wyoming invasion of 1892. They were allowed to tear up local brothels and saloons. They drank champagne and celebrated while Johnson County buried Nate Champion and Nick Ray. The evidence against them was overwhelming. Nate Champion's diary, witness testimony. The death list found in Frank Canton's grip, 70 names, contracts for murder, but the cattle barons had power and money, and they used both. The trial was moved to Cheyenne, friendly territory. The lead attorney for the invaders was Willis Van Devanter, who would later become a U.S. Supreme Court justice. Witnesses were paid off. Governor Barber prevented the defendants from being questioned. The case dragged on for months as the defense delayed, maneuvered, and stalled. Johnson County couldn't afford to keep prosecuting. With the state refusing to bear any costs, the county faced bankruptcy. After examining 1,064 potential jurors without seating a jury, prosecutors finally agreed to dismiss all charges. The Texas gunmen were given $750 each and commemorative rings, then sent home. Not a single person was convicted. Not one day of prison time served. But the killings didn't stop. In October 1892, 2 alleged horse rustlers were gunned down by range detectives east of the Bighorn River. On May 24, 1893, Nate Champion's brother Dudley came to Wyoming looking for work. He was shot and killed by Mike Shaughnessy, one of the invaders who'd escaped the TA Ranch siege. A coroner's inquiry ruled it self-defense. Shaughnessy left the country before further investigation could continue. The Johnson County War ended in legal ambiguity, but its political consequences were seismic. Wyoming voters were outraged. The Republican Party, closely associated with the cattle barons and the WSGA, was decimated in the 1892 elections. Democrats swept into power, winning the governorship in both houses of the state legislature. Republican Senator Francis E. Warren lost his seat. Johnson County gave one of the largest majorities in the state to Democratic presidential candidate William Jennings Bryan in 1896. The Wyoming Stock Growers Association never recovered. Plagued by continuing economic troubles and public disgust, The organization was fundamentally altered in 1893 when it opened its membership to small stock growers, the very people it had tried to exterminate. More importantly, Wyoming citizens had made it abundantly clear through their votes and public resolutions that they would not tolerate abuses like the invasion of Johnson County. The era of the cattle barons' absolute power was over, but the human toll was devastating. Between 20 and 40 people died in the Johnson County War and its aftermath. Families were destroyed. Communities were torn apart. Men like Nate Champion, hard-working, law-abiding citizens who simply wanted to build a life on public land, were murdered and branded as criminals by newspapers owned by the men who killed them. Today, monuments mark the sites. The TA Ranch still stands, bullet holes preserved in the barn and ranch house. A 7-foot bronze statue of Nate Champion stands near the Jim Gatchell Memorial Museum in Buffalo. The hoofprints of the past museum in Casey preserves the history. And in the town that was once Casey, named after homesteader John Nolan's KC brand, a historical marker stands near the approximate location where Nate Champion made his last stand. The Johnson County War exposed the brutal reality behind the romantic myth of the Old West. It showed what happened when wealthy men believed they were above the law, when governors and senators conspired with murderers, when an entire system of government protected the powerful at the expense of the powerless. For one brief moment in April 1892, ordinary citizens stood up to that power. Sheriff Red Angus and his posse of 200 men surrounded a private army and prepared to administer justice. They were stopped, not by the invaders, but by the U.S. cavalry acting on presidential orders. The military saved the bad guys that day, but in the long run, the people of Wyoming won. They used their votes to dismantle the system that had enabled the invasion. They changed their state's politics for a generation. They proved that even on the frontier, even in the Wild West, there were limits to what wealth and power could buy. Nate Champion died in the snow with 28 bullets in his body and a diary in his pocket. But his 7-hour stand gave Johnson County time to organize. His courage inspired 200 men to ride through the night. His death turned him into a martyr and a symbol. The invasion failed because one man refused to surrender. The cattle barons' empire crumbled because ordinary people refused to accept that might makes right. That's the real story of the Johnson County War. Not a romantic tale of frontier justice, but a brutal reminder that in America, when citizens stand together, even the wealthiest and most powerful can be held accountable. It just took longer than it should have, and it cost more lives than it should have. But justice, however delayed, eventually came.